This Parsha Podcast is dedicated by my dear friend Alen Lvovich in loving memory and leilui nishmas, his wife's maternal grandfather, Sander ben Lazar. He was a patriarch of a family that emigrated to the United States from Odessa in Ukraine, and they were escaping rampant anti-Semitism, and they established a Jewish home in Brooklyn, and his grandchildren are now honoring his memory with increasing their observance and their growth in their Judaism in New York. It's a wonderful tribute to their grandfather, Sander ben Lazar. May his soul be elevated in heaven. I have to begin with an apology. I have to apologize because I underestimated the audience. You see, for 10 or 12 weeks now, I've managed to write a new newsletter each Friday, and I'm very proud of that, and we hope I can continue doing it for the duration of this cycle of the Torah. But every newsletter, you got to write the newsletter, and then you have to send it. And when I send it, the email system that I use, you have to put in a subject line. That's going to appear in the inbox, the subject line. That's the first thing, or perhaps the only thing, that the email recipient will see. And I always try to find I have to find a way to persuade someone to click on it. It's got to do something which is a little bit like a clickbait, a little hook in the subject line. And I wrote the newsletter. I thought the newsletter was fine. It was good. It was maybe even very good, but I was not happy with the subject line. It was okay. It was like the naming of Moshe, or what's in the name, or put your name on it. It was good, but it wasn't good enough. And then I remembered that I had written an email newsletter in April of 2021. So it's almost 4 years ago. And it had an amazing piece of copy, as they say in the industry, a real eye-catching subject line that was, your trauma is your superpower. It's a subject line that really gets you. It makes you want to open it and read what the content of the message is. And I remembered that the message that I had written 3.5 years ago, almost 4 years ago, it was a similar idea to what I'd written presently, what I'd written this past week. So I discarded the lackluster subject line. And I said, I'm just going to reuse the old one. Come on. We see, dozens of new emails a day of new subject lines in the email. There's no way that anyone's going to remember what I had written 3.5 years ago. No way. So I just put in the old subject line, your trauma is your superpower. I sent it, and that's it. And then Shabbos, there was a Shalom Zachar in the neighborhood. So I went to the Shalom Zachar, and I'm chatting with some of my friends, 2 of my friends. And I asked them, well, did you read the newsletter this week? I was very proud of it. I wanted to know if they read it. He said, well, it's old material. I don't want to read it. I said, what do you mean old material? I just wrote it I spent the whole week, I spent hours writing this newsletter. No. I remember you wrote it a few years ago. And then the other guy, so I was talking to 2 guys, two gentlemen, 2 friends of mine. He's like, yeah, I remember it also. And my friend Jacob even told me, he's like, I'm so happy you're finally reusing content. You're finally recycling material. I said, no. This was an old subject line, but a brand new email. The content was new, but I have to apologize because I underestimated the audience. Alas, you were too good. I can't even slip that past you. So we're not going to do that anymore. All the subject lines will be new as well. I'm speaking to you from frigid, frozen Houston. Today we had the biggest snowstorm, I heard someone said, in 130 years, since 1895. And I Googled it, and apparently there was 20 inches of snow, so we didn't top that. But we did top apparently the one from 1940 and the one from 1960. And of course, we don't have adequate gear. So what everyone does, they put on like 2 sweaters and a thin coat and maybe some gloves. But we had a great time. Everyone's off from school. The yeshiva high school is closed. The elementary school is closed. Everything's closed. And everyone's having a great time. And the kids were so delighted and so excited. The boys played tackle football with their friends. Now, as you may know, Houston's not very topographically varied. It's all flat. But they found a retention pond. They have retention ponds and this nice little slope. So they went sledding in Houston, Texas. Who would believe it? But of course, I was avoiding driving. Houston drivers are not known for their adept skill under normal conditions. No snow tires, no all-wheel drive. But the school's canceled. The Yeshiva High School's canceled. But you know what's not canceled? The Parsha Podcast. So I dug out, I got to the car even tonight. It's Tuesday night. We woke up this morning. There was, the whole place was blanketed with snow. I get to the car. I got to dig it out. It's reminded me of my childhood growing up in New York. You turn the car on and it's still covered in snow. I got to put the windshield wipers on, but they were frozen in place. It's got to dig it out. And it was really hearkening back to my youth. But we managed to do it. I put on snow mode, driving. The streets are empty. Just a little bit of sloshy snow. We're here. We're in the Torch Center. We're not weak-kneed. We're not fragile. We're in the Torch Center. It's Tuesday night. We're live on torchzoom.com Tuesdays at 8 p.m. Inclement weather does not stop us. It's the Parsha Podcast. It's Parshas Vaeira. It's the book of Exodus. Moshe was nominated last week to go be the savior who will redeem the Jewish people, who will spearhead the Exodus. And he tried, and it just was a total debacle the first time. And he comes back to God and he complains. Instead of helping the Jewish people, things got worse. Moshe's first attempt to secure the nation's freedom was a disaster. It fell in its face, and God speaks to Moshe. I appeared to Abraham, my son Jacob, with the name Kel Shaddai. I didn't deliver on my promises, but I'm going to deliver. I'm going to redeem the people. I'm going to save them. I'm going to spare them. I'm going to redeem them for languages of salvation. I'm going to bring them to the land. Of course, we drink 4 cups on the Passover Seder to recall the different dimensions of the Exodus. Moshe complains a little bit. I can't speak. Aaron will help you. Moshe speaks to the Jewish people. We're going to do this again. And they are so consumed with work, they cannot hear him because they are completely exasperated. But of course, the main body of the Parsha is the plagues. The first 7 of what will be 10 plagues are featured in our Parsha. Aaron strikes the water, turns to blood. Plague number 1. Aaron strikes the water a second time, and a massive frog comes out, and that frog spawns lots of frogs, and they're everywhere. And then the third plague, Aaron strikes the dust of the land, and it turns into lice. And then there's mixed wild animals, and pestilence, and boils. And finally, the Parsha ends with the 7th plague, the plague of hail. This is the final plague of our Parsha. 3 more to come next week in Parshas Bo. Spoiler alert, there will be a total of 10 plagues before Pharaoh is completely humbled and he banishes them from the land. But now he's still resisting. He still thinks that he's in control. He still thinks that he has a say in the matter. He's hardening his heart. He's resisting to succumb to God. And even when he wants to yield, God hardens his heart. There will be 10 plagues, 3 more in next week's Parsha. But today I want to focus on plague number 7, the plague of hail. You mess with the Jews, there's hail to pay. Let's take a closer look. Now, this is a bit of a complicated study. It's maybe a bit more textual than most Parsha podcasts. It helps to follow along with the aid of the actual words of the Parsha. Let's begin. The final 23 verses of our Parsha detail the plague of barad, of hail, the warning, the implementation, and the consequences of this plague. And when we read these verses very carefully, we notice all sorts of interesting things. It begins, like many of the other plagues, a standard warning. God tells Moshe, wake up in the morning and go stand before Pharaoh and tell him, so says God Almighty, the God of the Hebrews, Shalach es ami v'yavduni, send my people and they shall serve me. Because this time, I'm going to send all my plagues to your heart and in your servants and in your nation, in order that you know that there's no one like me in all the land. This is the threat. This time, we had 6 plagues already. This time I'm sending all of my plagues to your heart and to your servants and to your nation, in order that you know that there is none like me in the land. The hail, the plague of hail, the 7th plague, is described in the warning to Pharaoh. Kol magefosai, all of God's plagues are about to befall Pharaoh. And it will have an impact. He will come to know that there's no one like God in all the land. Now, why is hail, this one plague, why is it all of God's plagues? And why will this make Pharaoh know true faith and to recognize that there's no one like God? We'll have to see answers to those questions. God continues the message that Moshe is to deliver to Pharaoh. For I could have destroyed you and your nation with the pestilence. I could have destroyed you with that. I could have eliminated you from the land, but I kept you standing. I kept you standing. Why? Because I want you to see my strength. And I want you to tell over and publicize my name in the entire land. So God is demonstrating maybe one of the central questions of the plagues. God could have twisted Pharaoh's arm with one plague and forced him to release the hostages, release the nation. And he doesn't do it. I could have done it with the plague of pestilence. I didn't. I kept you standing because I want you to learn something. I want to show you my strength. I want you to publicize my name throughout all the land. And again, we see the idea that hail, there's something about that will thoroughly change Pharaoh's attitude. You're still treading upon my nation. You're still refusing to send them. Behold, this is the actual threat. I will rain tomorrow. Heavy hail, an unprecedented hail, the likes of which Egypt has never seen from the day it was founded until today. So that's the plague. That's the warning that Moshe is to convey to Pharaoh. And then he gives him advice. You can mitigate the effects of the plague. This is 9:19. Send the message. Gather in your flocks and everything else you have in the field, because all people and all beasts, everything that's in the field that won't be gathered into the house, the hail will strike them and they will die. And then we have 2 verses, 20 and 21. Some people listened, some people didn't. This is part of the message, the threat of the plague, is that you have some way to minimize the impact. The plague, the hail, will strike everything that's outside of the house, everything that's in the field. But if you take your servants and your possessions and your animals, you bring them inside, then they'll be spared. And there's like a parenthetical set of verses. Those who feared God, they brought their animals in. They brought their servants in. And those who did not pay attention to the word of God, they left their servants and their animals outside, and those were destroyed. And then finally we have 9:22, the actual plague. God tells Moshe, stretch out your hand to the heavens, and there will be bara, there will be hail throughout all the land of Egypt. And it'll strike people and animals and all the grasses and all the trees and the fields. There's going to be this unprecedented hail. Now, there's an interesting comment here in Rashi that we're going to come back to. The verse says, God tells Moshe, stretch your hand out al hashemayim, which means on the heavens. Now, what does it mean to stretch your hand on the heavens? You could do it towards the heavens, but not on the heavens. So Rashi says 2 interpretations, either that it means in the direction of the heaven. Alternatively, God lifted Moshe above the heavens, and he could strike the heavens from below. So strike the heavens, you're above it, you could strike it because it's below you, which is a very interesting comment in Rashi, and we'll get to that again in just a little bit. So indeed, Moshe lifted his arm upon the heavens, And God unleashed this thunder and this hail, and there's fire amidst the hail, and it's descending, it's raining down upon the land like rain upon the land of Egypt. There's thunderous sounds, and there's hail, and there's fire, and it's being rained down upon the land of Egypt. And they have a description of this hail. It's borrowed, it's hail, and there's fire that's flashing amidst the hail. It's a miracle within a miracle. It's a song of ice and fire. The water and the fire, they made peace amongst themselves to do the will of God. Usually, fire and water are opposites. You have fire, you want to stop it, you want to quell it, you want to extinguish it, you bring water. These two, suddenly they made peace. Like in heaven, there's peace, and that came down. The unity of the water and the fire was packaged up together in heaven, and it descended down in the hail upon the Egyptians. And the hail struck the entire land of Egypt, and all that was in the field from man to beast, and all the greenery of the field, and all the trees of the field, they were all destroyed and shattered with the hail. And only in the land of Goshen, the land where the Israelites lived, there was no hail. That's the plague as promised. And then verse 27, we have Pharaoh's reaction. And it's a very surprising reaction. Vayishlach Paro, and Pharaoh sent a message, and they called Moshe and Aaron. Vayomer Aleim, and he said to them, Chatasi apam, I have sinned this time. God, Hashem hu atzadik, God is the righteous one, and I and my nation are the wicked ones. Pharaoh seems to be a changed person. I sinned. God is righteous, and I'm the guilty party. And then he makes a request to Moshe, plead with God, stop the thunder, stop the hail. I'll send you, I promise, I don't want you to stay anymore. I give in. I yield, I succumb. Pharaoh is crying, Angel. And Moshe responds, I'm going to go outside the city, and I will spread out my hands in prayer, and the thunder will cease, and the hail will be no longer, so that you know that the land belongs to God. Moshe says to Pharaoh, I'm going to go outside the city, and I'll spread out my hands to God in prayer, and the thunder will stop, and the hail will stop. Now, why does Moshe have to leave the city to pray? And why does he have to extend his hands out in prayer? There's lots of prayers that Moshe did previously where he doesn't need to leave the city, and he doesn't need to spread his hands out in prayer. And somehow when it comes to ending this plague, the plague of hail, there are extra requirements. So Rashi tells us, well, the city was full of idols, and how could you pray to God in a city full of idols? Said to go outside the city. Now, the problem with this, the Ramban already asks, is that in plagues number 2 and 4, which is the frogs and the mixed wild animals, Moshe prays, and it's apparently done without these extra stipulations. He's not going outside the city, and he's not raising his hands in prayer. So why is hail different? But then Moshe continues. Before he actually goes and prays, he adds a quizzical statement, and he tells Pharaoh, and you, or regarding you and your servants, I know that you have yet to be fearful of God. That's the end of the conversation. And the Torah kind of interjects by surveying the damage of the hail. It talks about the different produces, the different yields that were stricken by the hail. It says that the flax and the barley, they were ripe and they were stiff, and that's why the hail broke them. But the wheat and the spelt, they were not damaged because they become ripe later on in the season. So this is fascinating to read. The Torah finds it to tell us, well, there's different types of crops. There was the wheat, and then there was the barley, and the flax and the spelt, and some of the crops were damaged. The flax and the barley, they broke because they were ripe. But the wheat and the spelt, they were not damaged by the hail. because they ripen later. Very interesting and bizarre. It's like, it seems so out of place. Like the Torah is telling us this little factoid that seems just terribly misplaced and inconsequential. Moshe goes out from Pharaoh and he leaves the city as he promised he needed to do. And he spreads out his hands in prayer. And indeed, the thunder stops and the hail stops and it ceases to rain down towards the earth. Now Rashi observes something very interesting about the cessation of the hail. So Moshe goes out and he spreads out his hands and he's stopping. He's outside the city and the thunder stops and the hail stops, but it doesn't stop. It doesn't cease. It doesn't get eliminated. The verse says that the raining hail does not descend down to the earth. So it's very interesting. The Midrash tells us, and Rashi brings it down, that Moshe did not undo the hail. The hail was raining down, and Moshe's prayer stopped it. It froze in place, and the prayer caused that the hail didn't fall down, but it didn't eliminate the hail. And the Midrash tells us, well, actually, there's still hail that is suspended mid-air. It's in limbo. It's already outside of its heavenly origin, but it hasn't quite descended down to earth, so it's there in place. It's suspended mid-air. And we discover, the Midrash tells us, that there's going to be a point in time where that hail is going to finish its route. There's going to be a war, an apocalyptic war that will kickstart the Messianic era, the war known as Gog and Magog. Very interesting, very scary maybe, conflict that we're told marks the beginning of the Messianic era. There's this war, this apocalyptic, worldwide, global war, and the hail from plague number 7 that Moshe prayed not to eliminate, but to have it stop raining down, it's still there. It's like these ballistic missiles that just froze in the air, and they're going to complete their journey, and they're going to somehow aid us in plaguing our enemies in the future. Very interesting. The Parsha ends. The hail stopped and the thunder stopped. And of course, Pharaoh hardened his heart and he did not send the Jewish people out as God had predicted. And of course, in next week's Parsha, Parshas Bo, we'll have the 3 final plagues that will ultimately compel Pharaoh to release the Jewish people. In fact, to banish them, to kick them out aggressively from the land. So there's a lot to unpack here. All sorts of curiosities in this plague. All sorts of apparent side points and anecdotes in the narrative of the hail. So let's begin with the cessation of the hail. Chapter 9, verse 33. The verse says, you read it carefully, it says that the hail stopped. It didn't fall down to the land. So Rashi observes, it's still in the air. It didn't drop all the way down. And some of the hail will yet fall in the future apocalyptic war of Gog and Magog. So look out for that. So this to me is a fascinating insight. We read about the Exodus, and we're told a lot of detail, right? Chapter 1 of Exodus tells us the whole story of the enslavement. And that was a story of centuries. And we have 15 chapters about the Exodus. And it goes beat by beat of what happened in 1 year at the very end of the Jewish people's experience in Egypt. We're told a lot about the Exodus. And our sages tell us that really the Exodus, this is all of redemption. This is the prototype and the blueprint for all redemption. So all future redemption, national redemption, maybe even personal redemption, it all is modeled after the Exodus. All redemption must have within it shades, elements of the Exodus from Egypt. So Messiah, for example, that's the ultimate redemption. It too will be modeled after the Exodus from Egypt. And it's an explicit verse in Scripture. In the book of Micah 7:15, chapter 7, verse 15, it's a very famous verse. Like the days of your exodus from Egypt, I will show you in the future wonders. And the Midrash even says that all the plagues that happened in Egypt will be revisited in the future redemption. We actually did a whole podcast on this subject in the Torah 101 channel titled The Miracles of Messiah, to just show how, or this whole idea that the miracles of Messiah will be based upon the miracles of the Exodus. So just, this may answer one of the most fundamental questions about the Exodus. God hardens Pharaoh's heart. God deliberately elongates the Exodus. It could have been one and done. One plague, and you just force him and you leave. Why is this elongated? Why are there all these unnecessary miracles and plagues and signs and wonders? It's a good question. One of the answers is if this is going to be the root of all redemption, we have to beef it up. Because even if there's a miracle that is not needed for the Exodus from Egypt, it may be needed for a future redemption, for a future Exodus. Because after all future redemptions are modeled after the Exodus. So only miracles that were included in the original Exodus can be included in the future redemption. So this is a well-known idea that the themes and elements of the Exodus will resurface in all future redemptions. But here we see a bit of a new idea. This apocalyptic war that will presage Messiah, the war of Gog and Magog, it will include not only miracles and signs and wonders that resemble the Exodus, but it will actually finish off the plague of hail that was not quite finished in the original Exodus. Some of those hailstones are still suspended in the air. This plague was not fully consummated. And the war at the beginning of the Messianic era, it will include a resumption of this plague, the plague of hail. So this means that there's something about the plague of hail that's connected to Messiah. When we think about Messiah, like what's the end state that Messiah brings us towards? There's something about hail that somehow can bring about that state. Now it's also interesting, Moshe stops the plague before it should have stopped. This plague ended prematurely. There was still hail to come, right? Some of that hail was frozen in place. It was designated to be part of this plague, but Moshe intervened. He pleaded with God. He departed the city. He spread out his hands in prayer, and he prematurely ended the plague. But we'll eventually get it. We'll get the Act 3 of this plague in a conflict that will be a harbinger of the ultimate redemption of Messiah. So to me, this is a very interesting idea. And it gives us a deeper appreciation of this plague in particular. There's something about hail that is so uniquely powerful, it could bring about a total submission to God in a messianic way. What do we know about the Messiah? Everyone will know God. There won't be any corner, any tiny point in the world where heresy will exist. You couldn't find a cave in which there's heresy. Nothing. It's total faith and knowledge of God that covers the world like water covers the seabed, the verse tells us. Like, is there any dry spots just in the middle of the Pacific Ocean? There isn't. There's nothing. It covers it all completely. There will not be a spot, a point, a tiny, tiny point of heresy in the times of Messiah. Vaeira kol pa'ul. Every creation will know that you created him. V'yavin kol yitzur, and every little creation and formation of God will know. V'yomer kol asher neshama ba'apo, and everyone who has a soul inside of them, they will all say Hashem Melech, God is King. There's no more heresy. And there's something about this plague that brings about the Messiah. So that's, to me, a fascinating insight. And there's another point here. Moshe stopped it prematurely. What would have happened in the counterfactual world where Moshe says, sorry, I'm not stopping it prematurely. I'm not going out of the city. I'm not spreading out my hands in prayer. The hail will finish doing its job. Implied from this idea is that would have brought about some degree of Messiah. We could have had some degree of Messiah, some fulfillment of this war, Gog and Magog. We could have had it in plague number 7. There could have been some clinching of total transformation of all of humanity that could have ushered the world towards its perfected state. That could have happened in plague number 7. Had all the hail fell. Had the hail finished completely, it would have fulfilled the objective of the war of Gog and Magog. Where? In Egypt. Thousands of years ago. These are all new ideas. They stick these things at the end of the Parsha, you know? They assume we'll never get to it. I always assume the end of the podcast, that's where you put all the gems, right? You hide it there because that way the people who are not so committed that they'll just turn off. A half hour, I arrived at, I finished my commute. That's it. I listened to half the podcast. So you always hide the gems, the diamonds, all the way at the end. This is like this Parsha. You read it. It's the Midrash. The Midrash says, well, this is something that has to do with Messiah. And Moshe stopped it prematurely. Absolutely fascinating. Now, I saw something, just to explain this, to understand this. I saw an incredible piece in a book that I mentioned last week, a book called Emunas Itecha, a book authored by Rabbi Moshe Wolfson. This book was recommended to me by my brother-in-law, Rabbi Botnick, and I bought it, and I absolutely love it. And it's a bit of a complicated piece, but to me, it revolutionized the understanding of plagues in general and the plague of hail and its future role in presaging Messiah in particular. So let's go a bit deeper here. There's a question, an obvious question that many of the commentators ask. If you go back to the 5th plague, pestilence, dever. Chapter 9, verse 3, the verse says, Moshe warns Pharaoh, the hand of God will be in your livestock that are in the field, in the horses, in the donkeys, in the camels, the livestock, and the sheep. There will be a very heavy pestilence, plague. That's the promise, and indeed, 3 verses later, verse 6, the pestilence did indeed kill all the animals in Egypt. But not a single animal of the Jewish people died. So how many animals are left in Egypt? 0, apparently. You read verse 6 of chapter 9. But then you look at the next plague. That was the 5th plague. This is the 6th plague. It's boils. And they take a little bit of the soot and they throw it up in the air in front of Pharaoh. And all the Egyptians are covered in these awful, terrible inflammations, these boils. And the boils affect ba'adam uva behima, humans and animals. Wait a minute. Animals, they're all dead in plague number 5. The verse says very clearly, Kol miknei, vayamos kol miknei. All the animals of the Egyptians died. So where are there any animals to get boils? That's Rashi's question in chapter 9, verse 10. Me'ayin hayu lehem habehemus. Where did they have the animals from? The verse says, verse 6, it's only 4 verses prior, all the animals died. So Rashi says, no, you looked at the verse in verse 6, you should have looked at the verse in verse 3. When Moshe warned Pharaoh, he didn't say all the animals will die. He said all the animals, asher basadeh, that are in the field. So this plague affected only the animals in the field. So if you took the animals and brought them into your house, well, then they would survive. So when Moshe conveys this warning, people hear the warning, and they understand from what Moshe is telling them, they understand that, well, the animals that are in the field will die, but the animals that are not in the field, ergo, I can deduce they will survive. So Rashi tells us, this is a quote, "V'hayare es dvar Hashem," and someone who was fearful of the word of God. They took their animals, once they heard the warning of Moshe, and the implicit message that if the animals are in the house, they'll be okay. The ones who were fearful of God, they took all their animals, brought them inside, and those animals survived. So after plague number 5, the pestilence, only those who feared God, only those Egyptians had any animals, because the other ones who didn't fear God, they left the animals outside and they all died. Now fast forward to our plague, the plague number 7, the plague of hail. Moshe included in his warning, there will be hail, there will be thunder, it's going to rain down from heaven. There's this warning to take the animals into the house. So this time it's not implicit in Moshe's words, it's explicit in Moshe's words. And in 2 successive verses, chapter 9, verse 20 and verse 21, we learn that some listened to Moshe and some didn't listen to Moshe. Those who were fearful of God, they took it inside. And those who didn't pay attention, who disregarded the word of God, they left animals outside and they died in the hail. But wait a minute. Rashi told me in his comment to verse 10 that the only Egyptians that had any animals were those who feared God. So it should have been 100% of the people feared God, and they took their animals inside both by pestilence and by hail. And therefore, there shouldn't be any animals that died in hail. Everyone's following the question here, right? It's a little complicated. I warned you, it's a little more textual than usual. It's helpful to just see it inside. You've got 7 plagues and all sorts of different moving parts. That's the question, and there's a famous answer. It's a bit of a counterintuitive answer. It's a lot easier to to listen to Moshe, to hearken to Moshe, to heed the word of Moshe when he doesn't tell you directly. Moshe says, animals outside will die, and you interpret from that, well, the ones inside will survive? Okay, I'll take them inside. That's easy. Moshe never told you to do something. You don't have to swallow your pride and take those animals inside, and I'm listening to Moshe. If it's only from the interpretation, the implicit message in the words of Moshe, you don't have to swallow your pride. You don't have to overcome the resistance to disobey authority. It's easier to fear God when it's only implicit in the words of Moshe. But when Moshe says, take him inside, and then the resistance to authority gets triggered, who are you to tell me what to do? I'm going to keep animals outside. And therefore the verse says, if someone was so fearful of God that even though Moshe told him, and they had to swallow their pride and to listen to Moshe, that's a sign that they truly feared God. Okay, let's put all this aside. So if you just zoned out in the last little complicated calculation, listen to this. The animals of Egypt will appear once again. Not in Parshas Vaeira, not in Parshas Bo, but the Jewish people leave. And 7 days later, they're being chased. And Pharaoh is coming, sus virachvo, with horses and chariots. Where are those horses and chariots from? The Torah tells us, this one's not a comment in Rashi, it's a verse in Scripture. Hayare Dvar Hashem, chapter 9, verse 20. The only people who had any animals that survived the plague of hail were those who were fearful of God. How did these people who were fearful of God only a few months later, join Pharaoh or contribute their animals to Pharaoh when he begins the hot pursuit of the Jewish people. If they are approved by the Torah as those who fear God, how can they allow their animals to be used to pursue the Israelites after the Exodus? What happened to the fear of God that they had exhibited during the plague of hail? So we have a lot of stuff here. Let's begin to go to the essence of the point. This is the big idea, to wrap all the points together. What is the secret of all these plagues? What's the point of all the plagues? There's a famous comment in the Zohar. Plagues are plagues. It's a bad thing. It's a punishment. It's God smiting the Egyptians. Yes. But plagues also brought with them blessing. Spiritual transformation. The plagues came and they destroyed and they shattered and they damaged and they punished. They plagued the Egyptians. But they also brought faith and a new way of looking at things and salvation and a remedy and redemption to the land, certainly to the Jews and even to the Egyptians. Let's go back to the beginning, the very beginning of the description of this plague, the plague of hail. Chapter 9, verse 14. God tells Moshe, go tell Pharaoh, this time, Bapamazos, this time, I'm going to send all my plagues. That's negative, right? It's plagues. And it's going to strike you in your heart. And it's going to strike your servants and your whole nation. Ba'avur, why? Why are you having these plagues? So you know that there's no one like me, b'chol ha'aretz, in all of the land. In the very same verse, Moshe is told, go tell Pharaoh, this is all of God's plagues. He's unleashing it all. Throwing the kitchen sink. That's a plague, right? That's negative. And what's the purpose of this? So that you will know, even Pharaoh, who's the epitome of rejection of God. When Moshe first introduces God, he declares, well, who's God? Well, I should listen to him. Even Pharaoh will know there's no one like God in all the land. So it's a plague mixed up, mashed up with a blessing of total and complete faith. That's the plague of hail, but it's really all the plagues. In every single plague, it's a punishment mixed up or married, paired with a wonderful transformative blessing, a wonderful transformative revelation, something which can completely transform your worldview. And the commentaries explain why exactly is the plague of hail described as all of God's plagues. So some suggest the previous plagues, you could have argued maybe there's some advanced sorcery. Moshe is just they had sorcerers in Egypt, and Moshe was even more talented than all the Egyptian sorcerers. And that was true maybe, or you could have argued that up to the point of plague number 7. In Egypt, there's no rain. There's no rain in Egypt. The waters of the Nile overflow. So rain itself is foreign. And certainly no hail. And never hail mixed with fire. And never hail mixed with fire mixed with these tremendous thundering sounds. There's no way to deny its miraculous nature. And thus, the plague of hail, argues the Orach Chaim, that proves that all the other plagues were done by God. They were divinely ordained. There's an amazing comment I saw from the Gaon of Vilna. There were 3 different elements in this plague. There was fire and wind and water. And this compiled together all the different plagues that God has sent. In Sodom, they were punished with hellfire, with fire. The flood was water. And the generation of the dispersal, that was dispersing them like wind. And here, in one plague, it's all 3 of them wrapped together. Okay. So something different about it. But on a more spiritual level, Moshe is telling Pharaoh, I'm going to bring hail from heaven. It's going to rain down. You recall the Rashi we cited in chapter 9, verse 22. God tells Moshe, spread out your hand al hashemayim, on the heaven. Rashi says, well, that can mean multiple things. I mean, towards the heaven, or there's maybe a different interpretation. God lifted Moshe above the heaven, and he was able to strike the heavens from above the heavens. What this is telling us, something very profound. Where did the hail come from? It came from a realm, a dimension above the heavens. This reminds me, maybe this is crazy to say. We know Moshe later on in the Torah, he went up to the heavens. And he came down with the Torah. And he came down with the tablets of the testimony. And here, Rashi's telling us, Moshe goes up above the heavens. Whatever the hail is, it comes from a very different dimension than the world that the Egyptians and their Jewish subjects occupied. It originated from above the heavens and it rained down upon them. So of course this is 100% not natural, something supernatural, but it's coming from a different dimension. It's coming from above the heavens. Above the heavens, there's no heresy, and there's no faithlessness, and there's no room even for the possibility of a lack of faith, of a lack of a palpable, tangible realization, a cognizance of the reality of God. The hail came from that realm, from that dimension, and it brought with it a rush, a bounty of this heavenly reality that we call faith. And that's why Moshe tells Pharaoh, this is all of God's plagues, but it's also all of God's blessings, because this will make you know something you didn't know previously. You'll know that there's no one like God. So the experience of hail, it's to remove the possibility of heresy, the possibility of a rebellion against God. It will deepen the faith of anyone who experienced it. It will make the presence of God more real and more tangible, more palpable. And of course, we call that. We have a word for tangible, real, palpable faith. It's called fear of heaven. When faith is 100% real, it's tangible. It's called fear of heaven. So this hail, it's a shower of fear of heaven. And it brought everyone closer to God. It brought everyone closer to the only power. The hail brought everyone close to the actual chief. Hail to the chief. And indeed, when Pharaoh summoned Moshe, what does he declare? What's his first response to this plague? God, Hashem hu atzadik, he is the righteous one. Va'ani va'ami harasham, and I and my nation, we are guilty. Pharaoh comes around. What is someone like Pharaoh saying like this? God is the righteous one. Pharaoh was brought around to faith. Where did that come from? It came from the blessing of the plague. The hail, yes, it was all of God's plagues, but it brought with it faith and fear of heaven. Moshe warns Pharaoh, and he warns the Egyptians about the hail. Even a warning of this plague brought with it the influence of God. The Torah tells us there were some Egyptians that heard Moshe saying that there's going to be hail and it's going to make you all know that there's no one like God. And simply by Moshe warning about the hail, before the hail even began to rain down upon them, the people were changed. And some of them actually began to experience fear of God. And when the hail fell, Pharaoh makes this astonishing statement, Chatasi apam, I have sinned this time, Hashem hatzadik, God is the righteous one, and me and my nation, we are wicked. But then the plague stops prematurely. There's this shower of plague mixed with blessing. It's a shower of faith, a shower of hail, but a shower of fear of heaven. And Pharaoh says, it's too much. And he asks Moshe to end it prematurely. And Moshe says, this is a bad idea. Verse 30, it's a very hard verse to understand otherwise. Before Moshe goes and prays, he says, you and your servants, I know, terem tiron, you don't have sufficient fear of God. You're asking me to end it, but be careful what you're wishing for. You're not ready. You have yet to become fully cognizant of God, fully fearful of God. The fear of God that rained down from heaven has not had sufficient time to solidify. So you have this rush of this experience, but it ends before it can fully consummate. And indeed, once the hail stops prematurely, the reservoirs of faith that it brought with it dried up. And even those Egyptians who exemplified fear of heaven, when Moshe warned them about the hail, they said, okay, we accept, we're going to be fearful of heaven. They were just as eager as all the other Egyptians when they began to chase the fleeing Jews in hot pursuit. So Moshe's praying. Think about what's the nature of Moshe's prayer. He's not asking to stop this shower of faith. It's not about that. It's about pausing it. He knew that this firestorm of faith, this hailstorm of faith, would yet be needed. So it's a prayer to suspend this plague / blessing for thousands of years. Suspend it, spend the hail mid-year until the correct moment for it to descend. And while it is true that to end the plague of frauds and to end the plague of the mixed wild beast, Moshe could do it in the city. And there's idolatry, so what? He could still do it. And doesn't need to stretch out his hands. This is a different level of prayer. Moshe is praying for the future generations, thousands of years later. It's a prayer of salvation in this war that's going to change the whole world. Such a prayer needs to ascend to very, very lofty heights and has to bypass all sorts of heavenly blockades. It needs a very special setting out to the city with outstretched arms. Now we read this line, it's describing, it's surveying the damage. It affected the barley and the flax, but it didn't affect the wheat and the spelt. To us, it seems like so tangential, so unimportant. But of course, there's a deeper lesson for us. The blessing and the plague are two halves of one experience. Whatever the plague affected, the blessing affected. So there was a plague and a blessing in the barley. There was a plague and a blessing in the flax, but it didn't touch the wheat. It didn't touch the spelt. There is a festival that we celebrate each year that marks the day of the Exodus. But it's really the Exodus is the culmination of this whole process of the Exodus. That festival is called the festival of Passover, of Pesach, of course. And there's a special offering that is brought exactly once a year on the second day of Pesach, known as the Omer offering. And it is a very unique offering in that it's an offering of barley. Now, barley, throughout all of Torah literature, is described as animal feed. It's an animal food. Yes, humans could eat it, but it's not a dignified food of humans. What is a more dignified food of humans? That is wheat. We bring a sacrifice, an offering on Pesach, on the Exodus, and it only orients around barley. It doesn't quite reach the level of wheat. Why? Because there was an experience of faith that came down that affected only the barley and didn't touch the wheat. Now, on a deeper level, we're told that Adam, his sin. So, of course, everyone knows he ate the apple, right? Where does it say that? Where does it say that it was an apple? It doesn't. Okay, it's made up. It wasn't an apple. Talmud says it was wheat. It was wheat. That's the tree of knowledge, good and evil, wheat. When a child begins to eat wheat, that's when they have knowledge. The Talmud proves this point. Had the full extent, the full measure of all the hail been unleashed, It would have smashed also the wheat, meaning the blessing would have affected the wheat. There would have been a level of revelation that is messianic in nature and would have fixed, so to speak, the blessing would have affected even the wheat, meaning that the sin of Adam would have been rectified. That's what would have happened in that counterfactual world, that the hail was allowed to unleash itself and was not stopped prematurely. We got the barley, the animal feed. We got the flats, by the way. Where's flats appear in the Torah? Flats is the offering of Cain. There was some sort of remedying, rectification of Cain's sin, but not Adam's. Had the full measure of hail fallen, it would have had a much broader effect. It would have struck the wheat as well, and the blessing would have been broader as well, and the offering of Pesach would have been a wheat offering. And the degree of revelation would have been much greater. And that is something that we still have to wait for. Now, to me, this was a whole new idea, a completely novel insight. First of all, the general principle that plagues were blessings as well. And yes, there was a need for 10 plagues, but really there's 10 different dimensions of blessings that were given, that were transmitted during this year of the Exodus. And it's an absolutely fascinating insight that the hail was stopped prematurely. And had all the hail fell, it would have resulted in a Messiah-like revelation, but it was stopped early, prematurely. It was too much to bear for Pharaoh. It could have been a transformation, the lights of Messiah. But yes, Moshe, with his prayer, he managed to freeze it mid-air. Hopefully, we will witness it very soon. Now, these are all very lofty ideas, but there was one line in this essay that I read. It's really a series of essays, which was very interesting. It's kind of a Hasidic / Kabbalistic way of internalizing these lessons. We read these parshios. Every year we go through these plagues again and again. And it's like, we know the story, right? We know the story. And really, if you eliminated Parshas Vaeira and you just skipped Parshas Bo, you just had the last 3 plagues, you could get the whole story. The narrative is complete. They were in Egypt and Moshe tried to save them, didn't work. And eventually God brought 3 plagues and he released the Jewish people. You could have omitted an entire parsha. But once we realize that the plagues, they're blessings as well, and they're revelations as well. And the hail is this incredible experience where Moshe goes up to heaven, above the heavens, and pulls something down that changes everyone and everything that it touches. When we read this each year, we absorb and we assimilate within ourselves some measure, some degree of these blessings too. There is a bounty of these experiences that are unlocked with the reading of these portions. To me, that's a very beautiful idea. We're reading it, we're understanding it, and hopefully we will be recipients of these blessings. We like to end up the podcast with a dilemma. This year's theme is Torah is your ID. So we have an idea. It's a very advanced idea. Lots of moving parts. I like it. And now let's get to the dilemma. We spent a lot of time in Egypt. 210 years. Well, it depends how you count. If you count when Joseph came, or when Joseph had children, or when the servitude started, but we were there for a long time. And they mistreated us very, very severely. In our Parsha, the Jewish people couldn't even talk to Moshe because they were so exasperated with labor. The Egyptians are our enemies. What do we think about the Egyptians today? How do we relate to the Egyptians? They did vile, heinous, villainous crimes to our people for centuries. How are we supposed to relate to such monsters? So I want to share a bit of a counterintuitive perspective. In the first plague, chapter 7, verse 19, God tells Moshe, tell Aaron, take your staff and strike the waters of Egypt. They'll turn into blood. The second plague, chapter 8, verse 1. And Aaron again stretches out his hands on the waters of Egypt, and the frauds are unleashed. Why is Aaron doing it? Why is Moshe outsourcing it? So Rashi tells us, well, the waters protected Moshe. He was a small baby in a little box, and he was floating on the water. It's not appropriate for Moshe to strike the water. So not the first plague, not in the second plague. So these waters, the waters of Egypt, that also drowned countless Jewish babies, Moshe has to appreciate it because it helped him a little bit when he was a 3-month-old babe. Similarly, the third plague, chapter 8, verse 12, God tells Moshe, tell Aaron the third time, stretch out your hand and strike the dust of Egypt and let it turn into tinim. Let it turn into lice. Why is Aaron striking the earth? Well, the earth helped Moshe. When he went out in that coming of age episode, he went out to Egypt and he saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew. He killed the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. So the sand, the dirt, the dust, the earth of Egypt did him a favor. He cannot strike it. Moshe must exhibit appreciation and gratitude to the waters of Egypt and to the dust of Egypt. But this is the clincher. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 8 and 9. Lo tisa'ev Mitzri, do not abhor an Egyptian. We cannot hate the Egyptian. We cannot reject an Egyptian. If an Egyptian wants to convert, join the people, we must allow him to come in after 3 generations. Why? Ki ger hayisa be'artso. Because you were a ger, you were a visitor, and you went into his land. Says Rashi, Af al pi shezarku zichurem liyar. Even though they threw our boys into the water, we still cannot despise them because they were hosts for us in our time of need. We cannot reject an Egyptian convert because we were sojourners in their land. The standard that the Torah has for us of how much we have to appreciate and have gratitude for the Egyptians, it's kind of mind-boggling. So they did terrible, terrible, terrible things to us. What does the Torah train us? Moshe doesn't hit the water. Doesn't hit the water not for the first, not for the second plague. Doesn't hit the earth because it did something good for him. And us collectively as a nation, these are villains who did terrible things to us. Nevertheless, we kind of became immigrants to their land. We must show them appreciation. If there was some tiny element of goodness that we received from the Egyptians, we must appreciate it. We must not abhor them. To me, this is a very powerful insight. We're very quick to negate and castigate and disregard people that do bad things to us. No one that we will meet will do as bad of a thing to us as the Egyptians did to our forefathers. And nevertheless, the Torah is telling us, when it comes to our assessment of them, we cannot reject them. We must have appreciation for even the little bit of goodness that they did for us. If you have a terrible boss, the worst boss in the world, the Torah is training us. If there's any tiny little bit of goodness that you received from them, you must not abhor them. It's a high standard, but that is what the Torah expects of us. I appreciate your attention. Joining us here from frosty Houston. There's a snowstorm and there's ice storms and you got to drive very gingerly and carefully. But I drove to the Torch Center. We got here safe and sound with the help of the Almighty. We had a Parsha podcast. Thank God. Thank you all for joining us live on torchzoom.com. Tuesdays at 8 p.m. Central. My email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. Have a wonderful day, a wonderful week, a fantastic and wonderful Shabbos upcoming. And please God, with the help of the Almighty, we'll gather together again next week, Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Central, torchzoom.com. It will be released, of course, in the podcast early Thursday morning with the help of the Almighty. But please God, we'll gather together again in good health and in great spirits for another Parsha podcast. Again, the address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com.